The 8-mile Goffstown Branch was the shortest of the 3 branches that stretched out from Manchester, and by 1965, it housed the fewest amount of customers. Since the 1930s, it no longer had a connection to any major lines or locations served by the B&M other than Manchester, and it was, in effect, a dead end at Goffstown. What it lacked in length or business, though, the Goffstown Branch surely made up for in the beauty and rural charm which made the Boston and Maine's presence in southern New Hampshire so memorable. It was, for all intents and purposes, a unique piece of railroad. Built as the New Hampshire Central Railroad and opened in 1850 between Manchester and Henniker Junction, the railroad became part of the Merrimack and Connecticut River Railroad in 1853 and later part of the Concord and Montreal system. Boston and Maine acquired the line in 1895, operating it as their Manchester and North Ware branch from Manchester to Henniker Junction, where it had a connection with the Worcester and Kentucky branch. The historic floods of March 1936 and a lack of necessity doomed the line's Henniker connection and the line's passenger service. A new terminating point was decided at Goffstown, and the branch was redubbed the Goffstown Branch. Following the truncation, the B&M served the branch's freight customers with various Concord and Manchester-based local freights and extra jobs. Freight customers on the line were a gas plant at Grassmere, New Hampshire Doors on the east side of the river in Goffstown, and Kendall Hadley Lumber and Merrimack Farmers Exchange in Goffstown Village on the western bank of the river. In the steam era, freight service was often provided by 260 and 280 steam locomotives. Photos of steam locomotives exiting the classic covered bridge at Goffstown speak to a time when steam-powered freight trains were a lively and regular part of New Hampshire's small towns and rural hamlets. The final run of a steam locomotive on the Goffstown branch came rather late in 1954, and it's an interesting story. The occasion was not a revenue freight extra, but actually a reenactment of a grade crossing accident at the New Hampshire Route 114 crossing for legal and claims purposes. Such reenactments of accidents were commonplace. The line had already been dieselized for freight service, but the accident took place the year before involving a steam locomotive, so the Boston and Maine secured K8 Class 280 number 2403 from Boston for reenactment purposes, as it was one of the only 280 types still operating. In the diesel era, freight service on the branch was often provided by EMD SW1s and GP7s, but Alco RS3s and later EMD GP9s and GP18s were all seen on the Goffstown branch at various points from the 1950s to the 1970s. Goffstown did not have much in the way of a freight yard. In fact, the facilities there consisted of little more than 2 parallel tracks and a set of crossover switches, which were used to run the engine around a train in order to head back to Manchester engine first. Cars for Merrimack farmers were unloaded at their outlet store, which was on one of the 2 parallel tracks near the Goffstown station. The 2 parallel tracks used to connect at both ends, but in the 1970s the switch near the covered bridge entrance was removed, meaning that cars for Merrimack Farmers Exchange had to be brought past the station and then backed down the other parallel track to be spotted at the outlet store. The end of track on the Goffstown branch, that is, the western end of track, was protected by a wooden barrier behind the West Lawn Cemetery, and the tracks beyond there to Ware and Henniker had long been removed. Despite the formal end of passenger service in 1936, passenger trains returned to Goffstown on a few noteworthy occasions. Firstly, Goffstown was the destination for some snow trains out of Boston, carrying winter sports enthusiasts headed for nearby Mount Uncanunic. In 1961, to celebrate the bicentennial of Goffstown's founding, the Boston and Maine supplied Bud Rail diesel cars for excursions into town. And on May 4, 1968, the Railroad Enthusiasts Club chartered a fan trip which ran to Goffstown. One of the most scenic and photographed locations on the Goffstown Branch was the bridge across the Piscataquag River at Kelly's Falls in West Manchester. This had originally been a covered bridge which burned on September 1st, 1941, and was later replaced with a wooden pile trestle. This was a popular diving spot and swimming hole for kids growing up on the west side, and continued to be long after the branch was abandoned. The trestle stood derelict for many years and was unfortunately removed in 2015 to make way for a new walking and biking bridge. Goffstown's neighborhood of Grasmere was once home to Grasmere Junction, a short-lived junction point between the Goffstown Branch, then known as the Manchester and North Ware Branch, and the Manchester and Milford. The Manchester and Milford is one of the Boston and Maine shortest-lived lines and was abandoned in 1926, making Grasmere Junction a forgotten location. One of the most notable customers on the Goffstown Branch, New Hampshire Doors Company, was located in the mill complex along the Piscataquag River at Factory Street. Until closing in 1980, the company received materials in boxcars at their siding, which was on a westward-facing switch and, as such, was usually switched by trains returning to Manchester. The mill complex was recently redeveloped into housing. The darkest day in the branch's history, and possibly the town of Goffstown as well, was August 16, 1976, the day the famous covered bridge in downtown Goffstown burned. The last active covered bridge on the Boston and Maine, the bridge was a source of enormous pride for Goffstown, another example of the close ties the railroad held with each and every community they served. The dramatic event is still fresh in the minds of Goffstown's citizens. Many shed tears as they crowded together to watch one of their town's proudest icons go up in flames. The fire was so hot that it blistered the paint on the fire engines, and smoke could be seen from Manchester, 8 miles away. Ken Holbrook was working the Goffstown office of Merrimack Farmers Exchange and had just finished ordering a carload of feed to be delivered by train from Bow when he learned from a stunned customer that the bridge was burning. Needless to say, the order had to be cancelled. The fire is believed to have been set either by children playing hooky from school — it was a common crossing point for those headed into town — or by a known arsonist who had been seen walking the tracks earlier in the day. It's not officially known who started the fire, but in town, theories abound. Photographs can hardly convey the dramatic nature of those 20 minutes which felt like hours. Yet one cannot help but stare at the images of this turning point in the town's history which affected so many. Many feel as though Goffstown lost something that day that can never be equaled nor replaced. In an almost poetic way, the blaze represented the sudden death of the railroad in small-town America as a whole, depriving communities of something that had always been familiar. As the bridge burned, 3 young residents, John and Doug Leonard and their friend Chris McLaughlin, scrambled to save the Goffstown, New Hampshire sign that was mounted on the right side of the western portal. Recognizing the importance of saving a recognizable piece of the bridge, they watched the sign drop into the river and then followed it as it floated downstream, fishing it out of the Piscataquag River after it teetered over the nearby dam. Today, that very sign resides in the Goffstown Historical Society. Contrary to popular belief and some incorrect information on trailside signs, Rail service to Goffstown did not end when the covered bridge burned in 1976. In fact, it continued on for another 4 years into 1980. The B&M decided not to replace the bridge, cutting off Merrimack Farmers Exchange and Kendall Hadley Lumber, which were both located on the west side of the river. A new end of track was established here on the east side of the riverbank, where the Boston and Maine's bridge had once stood. As the 1980s arrived, the Boston and Maine was still servicing New Hampshire Doors Company in Goffstown, as well as Home Gas at Grasmere and Kendall Hadley Lumber, who, although isolated, was having their shipments arrive at New Hampshire Doors' loading dock and were then trucking their product across the river to their plant. Wintertime conditions on the Goffstown branch were particularly difficult, coupled with the poor track conditions of later years. Russell F. Monroe photographed a derailed boxcar at the switch for New Hampshire Doors on December 4, 1971. Despite the poor track conditions, in later years, the Boston and Maine's brand new EMD GP38-2s and even a GP40-2 delivered in 1978 made slow, plodding runs from Manchester to Goffstown and back, 8 miles at 10 miles per hour or slower, just to deliver a boxcar or two. The loss of the covered bridge and the inability to access the runaround track on the west side of the river presented a particular problem for the Boston and Maine. There was nowhere to run around cars for New Hampshire Doors so that they could be spotted on the siding boxcar first. Coming from Manchester, entering the siding would have been locomotive first. To solve this problem, the Boston and Maine performed a maneuver known as dropping a car by, or flying switch. The locomotive would be uncoupled from the boxcar and run ahead on the track, just past the siding, where it would wait. The track would then be switched to the siding, and the lone boxcar would be allowed to roll freely with a brakeman at the ready on the brake wheel. The car would roll onto the siding and be stopped at the unloading platform with the brakeman turning the brake wheel. In the end, the backwoods charm that had made it so attractive could not save the Goffstown branch. New Hampshire Door closed in 1980, leaving a meager 2 customers remaining on the entire 8 mile of track. Poor track conditions eliminated the possibility of delivering propane to Home Gas. No longer able to use the loading dock at New Hampshire Door, Kendall Hadley Lumber opted instead to truck its product from Manchester Yard. Boston and Maine EMD GP7 1557 held the dubious honor of leading the last freight train over the branch on September 9, 1980. The Boston and Maine abandoned the Goffstown branch in its entirety in February 1981, and the tracks were removed in the following years. With that, all railroading on the western side of the Merrimack River in Manchester and beyond became but a specter of the past. Where blue Boston and Maine diesels once rolled, bikers and hikers now roam and admire the peaceful tranquility of what was once the Boston and Maine's Goffstown branch, now enjoying a new life as the Goffstown Rail Trail. Here in downtown Goffstown, the Goffstown Depot survives as a coffee shop, and in 1984 was moved on top of where the rails used to stand.